In recent months, a story has emerged from the heart of Africa that has sent shockwaves through global politics, economics, and the very foundations of power. The world watched in disbelief as Ibrahim Traoré, the young and defiant leader of Burkina Faso, made a statement that echoed far beyond his nation's borders: "Gold stays in Africa." Those 5 words became a rallying cry, a declaration of sovereignty and a direct challenge to the world's most powerful economies. But to understand why this moment matters, we need to look deeper into the forces that shaped it: the long corridors of Washington's power, the silent control of European markets, and the centuries-old exploitation of African resources. For decades, Africa has been one of the richest continents in the world beneath the ground, yet one of the poorest above it. From the diamonds of Sierra Leone to the oil fields of Nigeria and the gold mines of Burkina Faso, global powers have extracted wealth from African soil in exchange for poverty, instability, and dependence. It's a cycle that has repeated for generations, justified by trade agreements, political partnerships, and financial aid that often benefits the donor more than the receiver. But in 2024, something changed, and it began with a public gold auction. When Traoré's government announced that it would hold a transparent, public auction for Burkina Faso's gold reserves and that the gold would not be exported without fair compensation, the news rattled investors from New York to Brussels. For the first time, an African leader was not just talking about independence but enforcing it. He was turning words into policy. The auction was live-streamed. Cameras captured local miners, government officials, and African business owners participating openly, something rarely seen in Africa's opaque resource markets. The symbolism was clear: Africa would no longer be looted behind closed doors. But what shocked the global community most was not the auction itself, it was what followed. Washington's analysts called it a threat to market stability. European trade representatives labeled it economic nationalism. Yet, for millions across Africa, it was a moment of pride. In villages and cities, people celebrated Traoré as a man who dared to stand up to the West. The African Union held emergency meetings, and neighboring countries began reconsidering their own contracts with Western mining corporations. The ripples were spreading. Behind closed doors, however, tension was rising. Reports surfaced that Washington and its allies were preparing policy responses. Some speculated about sanctions, others about trade pressure. Western media began portraying Traoré as a radical populist, an unpredictable figure who might destabilize the region. But for Traoré, this was not about fame or defiance, it was about dignity. In a rare speech broadcast on national television, he said, "We are tired of being rich in resources but poor in life. Our gold will no longer leave Africa for the benefit of others." His words were simple but powerful, and they resonated across the continent. In Washington, economists and political advisors debated the long-term implications. Africa supplies a significant portion of the world's gold, cobalt, and rare earth minerals, the very materials that power modern technology. If more nations followed Traoré's example, the entire balance of global trade could shift. The so-called Washington Corridor, a network of economic influence stretching through international banks, investment firms, and diplomatic channels, suddenly faced a new kind of resistance, one rooted not in violence but in economic self-determination. The situation became even more complex when Russia and China expressed open support for Burkina Faso's decision. Chinese media praised the move as a historic correction of global injustice, while Russian officials offered technical and financial cooperation. For the West, this development was alarming. It suggested a new axis of influence was forming, one that could undermine decades of Western dominance in Africa. The global chessboard was changing, and the smallest player had made the boldest move. Meanwhile, ordinary people in Burkina Faso felt a renewed sense of hope. Gold miners who had long worked under foreign-owned companies were finally seeing local participation and profit sharing. The government promised that a portion of gold revenue would go directly to building hospitals, schools, and infrastructure. For a country that had seen years of coups, poverty, and instability, this was a new beginning. The narrative was shifting from dependency to ownership, but the resistance was fierce. International corporations that once controlled African gold began withdrawing operations, citing uncertain political conditions. Western embassies issued warnings about security risks. International ratings agencies downgraded Burkina Faso's credit standing, making it harder for the country to borrow money. In other words, the machinery of pressure had been activated. This was not just a financial reaction, it was a political statement. You cannot defy the system without paying a price. Despite these pressures, Traoré stood firm. He reiterated his message that the wealth of Africa belongs to Africans. His defiance earned admiration from across the continent, but also made him a target of powerful forces that profit from Africa's dependency. Some analysts compared his movement to that of Thomas Sankara, another revolutionary leader from Burkina Faso who once dreamed of African unity and independence but was assassinated in 1987. History, it seemed, was repeating itself, but this time with global media watching. As the public auction concluded, Burkina Faso announced record participation from African investors and local businesses. The message was clear: Africa could sustain itself if given the freedom to do so. Global markets reacted sharply. Gold prices fluctuated, and speculation ran wild about whether other nations like Mali, Niger, or Ghana would follow suit. Within weeks, diplomatic envoys from the United States and the European Union arrived in West Africa seeking dialogue, a word often used to mask strategic negotiation. It was evident that Washington's corridor, long used to controlling Africa's economic lifelines, was now facing a serious challenge. The story reached every major news outlet. Some framed Traoré as a visionary, a symbol of Africa's long-delayed awakening. Others painted him as reckless, accusing him of risking regional stability. But one thing was undeniable: his actions had forced the world to confront a question it had ignored for too long: who really owns Africa's resources? Over the next several months, more African nations began reviewing their gold export policies. Some canceled contracts with foreign corporations, while others demanded renegotiations for fairer terms. Across Africa, young people, the largest generation in the continent's history, saw Traoré's stand as an inspiration. They began to believe that Africa's destiny could be rewritten not by outside powers, but by Africans themselves. As Western leaders continued to debate economic sanctions, new alliances began forming. Burkina Faso strengthened its ties with neighboring countries that shared similar ambitions. A new regional initiative was proposed, an African Gold Alliance aimed at creating collective control over the continent's mineral wealth. The idea was simple but revolutionary. If Africa could unify its resources, it could control global prices and dictate terms, just as OPEC did with oil decades ago. This idea terrified global financial institutions. Africa, long treated as a supplier, was now thinking like a producer. It was no longer begging for aid. It was setting its own prices. The very foundation of the global economic order was being questioned, and Washington's corridor, once unshakable, was beginning to crack. In the halls of the U.S. State Department, confidential reports described Traoré's movement as a strategic disruption. The Pentagon issued security assessments, fearing that growing Russian and Chinese influence could turn West Africa into a new geopolitical battleground. But for ordinary Africans, this was not about geopolitics. It was about justice, pride, and control over their own future. For the first time in decades, they were not waiting for permission, they were making decisions. As the months passed, the effects of the gold auction rippled through markets and politics alike. African gold stocks rose in value. Local industries began expanding. In some regions, gold-backed digital currencies were even proposed to reduce dependency on Western financial systems. And while critics warned of inflation and instability, supporters saw something much bigger: a rebirth of confidence.
By the end of the year, Traoré's words, "Gold stays in Africa," had become a slogan printed on banners, T-shirts, and online campaigns across the continent. His face appeared alongside historical figures who had once fought for African independence. He had become a symbol, not just of resistance, but of possibility. The story of Troy versus Washington's corridor is not simply about gold. It's about power, history, and identity. It's about a young leader daring to do what many before him only dreamed of, reclaiming Africa's right to determine its destiny. Whether his movement succeeds or fails, it has already changed the conversation. It has reminded the world that Africa is not a playground for foreign powers. It is a continent of nations, of people, and of immense potential. And as global eyes continue to watch Burkina Faso, one truth remains clear: the era of silent exploitation is coming to an end. The gold that once fueled empires may now fuel independence. The corridors of power in Washington, Brussels, and beyond are beginning to realize that Africa is no longer waiting at the door. It is building its own house, with its own hands, on its own land. The world has entered a new chapter, and the question now is not whether Africa can rise, but whether the world is ready for the rise of Africa.